You think knights were noble heroes. Wrong. Behind the armor were broken children, ripped from families, beaten, starved, and forced to kill before they even became men. Knights weren't born, they were manufactured, through blood, fear, and torture. And the nightmare began when boys were just 7 years old. What you're about to hear will haunt you forever. Imagine being 7 years old. Your world is your home, your parents, your bed, your toys. Suddenly, that world ends. A door slams behind you, and you will never see your family the same way again. This was fostering, the ritual that began a knight's training. Noble families handed their sons over to other households, not as guests, not as students, but as sacrifices. Parents weren't trusted to train their own children. Why? Because parents might show mercy, a stranger would not. These children were ripped away young enough to still need their mother's comfort, but old enough to understand the betrayal. They weren't treated as boys anymore. They were experiments, prisoners, test subjects for a brutal system that valued obedience and cruelty above all else. And the very first lesson, not swordplay, not honor. Pain, the boys' lives were stripped of joy, no warmth, no freedom, only cold stone chambers where every moment was monitored. Chores weren't chores, they were rituals. Every day, they polished weapons until their hands bled, carried armor until their backs ached, scrubbed helmets until their fingers cramped. This wasn't busy work, it was indoctrination. Steel became sacred. They were taught to worship the sword like a holy relic, and the weapons weren't safe. Training swords were designed heavier than real blades, meant to injure. Wooden swords could shatter, sending splinters into flesh. Every exercise was a reminder, pain is constant. A male shirt weighed 80 pounds. Imagine a child barely tall enough to lift it, stumbling under its crushing weight. They learned not to fight with comfort, but to suffer with endurance. And the greatest fear didn't come from the masters, it came from each other. Brotherhood, friendship, those words meant nothing here. Children were turned into rivals. Pages were forced into brutal contests. Wooden duels until bones cracked. Wrestling until one collapsed. Endurance trials that pushed them to the edge of death. The rule was merciless. Only winners were rewarded. Losers were humiliated, beaten, or starved. Imagine standing over your friend, his lips split open, blood staining his teeth. Do you stop? If you do, you lose, so you keep striking. You betray your own childhood instincts for survival. And the message was clear. Pain is the only truth. Violence is the only law. Compassion is weakness. By age 14, any shred of innocence was gone. And that's when the nightmare deepened. Picture a boy kneeling on stone floors, his small hands trembling as a whip cracks across his back. Not once, not twice, dozens of times. His screams echo through the hall, but no one comes to help. This wasn't punishment, it was training. The logic was twisted but simple. If a child could not endure pain from a whip, how could he endure steel tearing through his flesh in battle? Every strike was calculated. Masters watched closely, searching for breaking points, waiting to see who would collapse. Some boys did break. They were sent home in disgrace, considered unworthy, defective. But others learned to swallow their cries. They became hollow, numb, perfect clay to be molded into killers, and the system was just beginning to break them down. At 14, the page became a squire. And this was no graduation, it was a death sentence in disguise. As a squire, you followed a knight into real battles. No more wooden swords, no more staged fights. This was steel, blood, and fire. You didn't just witness violence. You lived it. One day, you marched into villages, torch in hand, burning homes while peasants screamed. The next, you stood beside your knight in court, pouring his wine as if nothing happened. This was the double life of knights. Killers one day, gentlemen the next. And the squire's duties were brutal. You dressed your knight in armor before battle. You cleaned the blood from his weapons afterward. You patched his wounds with rags, dirt, even human hair when nothing else was available. And sometimes you decided who lived and who died. Allies bleeding on the ground, some were too far gone. A squire's knife ended their suffering quickly, but nothing prepared them for the final test. Every squire faced the same ritual, blooding. It wasn't about bravery in battle. It wasn't about fighting an enemy soldier. No, this test was darker. A prisoner would be bound, sometimes a captured bandit, sometimes a messenger, sometimes just an innocent unlucky enough to be caught. The knight would hand his squire a sword and give a simple order, kill. The boy's hand would tremble, His stomach would twist, but hesitation was weakness. Failure meant disgrace or death. And when the sword finally fell, something inside the boy broke. Fear, empathy, innocence shattered. What remained was not a child, not even a man. What remained was a weapon, and yet the price of becoming a knight wasn't fully paid. At 21, if you survived, you reached the final stage. The ceremony of knighthood looks noble in paintings. A young man kneeling, a sword tapping his shoulder. But the truth was far more brutal. It wasn't just a ritual, it was a test. Could you kill without hesitation? Could you obey an order, even if it meant slaughtering innocents? Could you watch friends die beside you and keep fighting? If yes, you became a knight, feared, respected, powerful, but inside, broken. The records are full of haunted men, knights who drank themselves into oblivion, knights who lashed out in rage, knights who vanished into solitude, unable to live among ordinary people again. Because behind every shining armor was a shattered child. So the next time you see knights in movies, remember this. They weren't heroes, they were victims, beaten, broken, rebuilt into killers. The Middle Ages didn't forge warriors. It forged trauma, and the horrors these broken men unleashed on the battlefield were worse than anything they suffered in training. Subscribe, because in the next episode we'll step into those battlefields, where the nightmares knights created were so savage even they trembled. You've seen how knights were made, torn from their families, beaten into weapons, but their true nightmare began on the battlefield, because here there were no rules, no mercy, only slaughter. What you're about to hear are the horrors knights unleashed and the demons they could never escape. The life of a knight wasn't constant glory, it was exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Imagine marching for days in armor that weighed as much as a small child. The air thick with the stench of sweat, rotting food and horses, feet blistered, throats dry, every step closer to death. And yet, this was the easy part, because ahead smoke rose, villages burned. Screams carried on the wind. Knights weren't marching to noble duels. They were marching to extermination, and when the order came, the killing began. Knights were businessmen of death, and their enemies were often defenseless. Villages stood no chance. Men were cut down as they ran. Women were dragged from their homes. Children were trampled under hooves. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a tool of terror. A knight might split a man in half with one swing, then ride on without looking back. Why such brutality? Because fear was more powerful than steel. If a single massacre terrified 10 villages, fewer would dare to resist. But the blood didn't wash off, not from the armor, not from the mind. Battlefields were one thing, sieges were another. Picture it, a castle under siege for weeks. Inside, starving families gnawed on rats. Outside, knights waited, their catapults hurling rotting animal corpses over the walls to spread disease. The stench was unbearable. The ground turned to mud, mixed with blood and waste. And when the walls finally broke, the slaughter was total. Knights stormed in, cutting down anyone in their way. No distinction between soldier or child. To them, everyone was the enemy. Chroniclers wrote of streets running red, of corpses piled so high they blocked the gates. And after the killing came looting. Jewels ripped from bodies, gold stolen from churches, women dragged into shadows. This wasn't honor, this was hell. Knights were trained to endure pain, but nothing prepared them for the sounds, the smells, the visions of war. The screams of men dying slowly, guts spilling out. The smell of burning flesh as villages went up in flames. The sight of friends crushed under horses, their helmets caved in like broken shells. They called it the fog of war. But knights carried that fog with them long after battles ended. Some knights woke in the night, screaming. Others lashed out in drunken rage, haunted by ghosts only they could see. In today's language, we'd call it PTSD. Back then, they called it madness. You've heard of chivalry, the code of honor, the protection of women, the defense of the weak. But on the battlefield, chivalry was a myth. Knights killed peasants for sport. They cut down prisoners after promising mercy. Some even used villagers as living shields. The truth, chivalry wasn't written for peasants. It was written by nobles for nobles. It only applied when knights dealt with other knights. Everyone else was expendable. To the poor, knights weren't heroes. They were monsters. Knight vs. Knight was rare, but when it happened, it was terrifying. Swords didn't glide cleanly like in movies. Blades stuck in flesh, tore through bone. Warhammers crushed skulls with a single blow. Axes split helmets like eggs, and armor didn't make you invincible. It made you slower, exhausted, and if you fell to the ground, you might suffocate under its crushing weight before anyone finished you off. Imagine lying in the mud, too weak to rise, air squeezed from your chest, the screams of war fading as the weight dragged you down. That was how many knights died, not from swords, but from suffocation. For those who lived through battle, survival came at a cost. Some returned home crippled, missing limbs, blinded, scarred. Others came back whole on the outside but broken inside. Nightmares, fits of rage, silence so deep it scared their families. Many drowned their pain in drink. Others vanished, leaving behind wealth and titles to live in solitude. And some never returned at all, not because they died, but because they couldn't bear to live among ordinary people again. Because once you had seen children burned alive, friends torn apart, bodies rotting in the sun, how could you ever sleep in peace again? The trauma didn't die with them, it spread. Knights raised on violence passed that same violence onto others, onto their families, their lands, their enemies. Generations inherited fear and cruelty as if the trauma itself was a disease, and so the cycle continued. Boys turned to killers, killers turned to broken men raised the next generation of killers. This was the true legacy of knighthood, not honor, not glory, but trauma echoing through history. So the next time you picture knights shining in armor, remember the truth. They weren't heroes, they weren't saviors. They were shattered children, forged into killers, unleashed on the world. The Middle Ages didn't give us legends, it gave us nightmares, and the scars they left still shape our world today. Subscribe, because the next time we'll go deeper into the hidden secrets of medieval warfare that even knights feared to speak of.